Hi, I'm Matt from Focus Training, bringing you the first in a series of brief videos about unconscious bias. We're looking forward to talking about this topic as it's critical for all leaders to be self-aware and regularly evaluating their own decision-making for bias, either conscious or unconscious, that can get in the way of making sound, intentional decisions. Unconscious bias specifically is a challenge because, as the name implies, we don't see it. It's a blind spot. These are attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our choices, our behaviors in an unconscious manner. Now, these can be favorable or unfavorable. So I might have an unconscious bias towards schools that are similar to my alma mater, thinking that those are good schools versus schools that look very differently. Or I might have unfavorable bias that is unconscious, leading me to avoid hiring certain kinds of people who have a cultural background or a different language that makes me uncomfortable and leads me to make decisions towards them in a negative sense. Either way, unconscious bias tends to develop over our entire lifetime. It's socialized into us through the examples of others, how we're taught, our exposure, or maybe even specific anecdotal experience. There are many different types of bias, and all of these can be conscious or unconscious. But as you're evaluating your own decision making for bias, it's worthwhile having some of these different types of bias in mind. The first example we could bring up is affinity bias, which is a preference for others that are like us. It's easy to feel more comfortable around people that are similar to us or have similar experiences. And that affinity bias can lead us to show preference for homogeneity or sameness. And that can really limit the diversity in our organizations or teams, or even just the diversity of thought that we allow in a meeting. Confirmation bias is another one that a lot of leaders struggle with. This is the bias towards prioritizing evidence for a decision that supports the decision we've already made or our preferences or assumptions. So if you've ever, as a leader, walked into a conference room knowing that you've already kind of made up your mind about how you want things to go, you may have experienced confirmation bias, leaning towards the arguments or examples or evidence that's brought forward in a meeting that supports the decision you kind of already made in your head. That's confirmation bias. There's attribution bias, which is sometimes described as halo or horn bias. Attribution bias is when we assign meaning to other people's behavior based on decisions we've already made about them. So if I hear you raising your voice in a meeting, and in my head I think, oh, that's because you're a bully. I'm attributing a meaning behind your actions that may or may not be valid because of something I've assumed about you rather than based on what I know to be true. Halo and horn bias are versions of that. If I've put a halo over your head, I've decided you're a good employee or a great leader, and now almost anything you do can reinforce that through confirmation bias. If I use horn bias, I might have decided you're a problem employee or you're trouble. And so now anything that you do will be passed through that filter. It can be difficult to recover from that sort of bias. These different types of bias rear their heads in our unconscious mind all the time. So the shrewd leader is regularly evaluating their own decision-making process to question whether these biases are at play. Be sure you watch for the other videos coming up in our series, as we'll explore different aspects of unconscious bias, how to turn bias from unconscious to conscious, and how to shift our approach to eliminate unnecessary or damaging bias from our decision making.